The year was 1943. Stalingrad had fallen. After months of fighting, the German army captured the city. Soviet forces retreated. German tanks reached the Caucasus and took control of the oil fields. The fuel shortage was largely solved. The initiative on the Eastern Front was once again in Germany's hands. 1944. The Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, but the German defense stopped the invasion. After days of fighting, the operation failed. A second front in Western Europe could not be opened. At the same time, the Soviet army continued to retreat eastward. The government in Moscow moved beyond the Ural Mountains. Independence movements among the peoples of the Caucasus accelerated. Soviet resistance in Europe collapsed. In the Pacific, the Japanese Empire maintained its superiority. Japanese forces inflicted heavy losses on the American Navy and kept control of the Chinese coast. Japanese rule in Southeast Asia continued. British and Dutch colonies could not be retaken. Manchuria was annexed by Japan. In Italy, the Axis government survived. Much of the Mediterranean came under the control of Axis navies. In North Africa, German and Italian forces captured the Suez Canal, taking control of one of the most important sea routes between Europe and Asia. By 1945, the outcome of the war was clear. Most of Europe had fallen under German domination. In East Asia, the Japanese Empire had become the most powerful state. The Axis powers had won one of the greatest military victories in history. But the real question was just beginning. Was winning the war enough to rule the world? The war was officially over. Germany crushed the last organized resistance in Europe. After months of surrender agreements, most of the continent was now under German rule. Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, Prague, Warsaw, Belgrade, Kiev, Minsk, and many other cities began enforcing the orders of the new administration. Victory parades filled the streets of Berlin. Germany declared itself the undisputed ruler of Europe. Italy retained its gains across the Mediterranean, while the Japanese Empire proclaimed victory throughout the Pacific and East Asia. The Axis powers had become the dominant force across 3 continents. After years of war, the United Kingdom accepted an armistice. The conflict ended without the need for an invasion of the British Isles. Across the Atlantic, the United States withdrew its military forces. Washington decided not to intervene in Europe again and turned its full attention to the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, the Soviet government continued operating east of the Ural Mountains. Soviet authority in Europe had effectively come to an end. The maps of the world began to change. Germany established new administrative territories across Eastern Europe. Japan expanded its borders throughout Asia. Italy increased its sphere of influence across the Mediterranean. The Second World War was over, but in reality, an entirely different world was only just beginning. Europe under the New Order. The first major task after the war was the reorganization of Europe. Berlin became the political center of the continent. Every major decision now passed through the German government. Austria was fully integrated into Germany. Poland disappeared from the map once again. Its territory divided into German administrative regions. The Baltic states were placed under direct German control. Belarus and much of Ukraine were governed by military administrations loyal to Berlin. France remained on the map, but only as a limited puppet state with no independent foreign policy or military power. Belgium and the Netherlands were reorganized under German occupation authorities. Denmark and Norway became strategic territories, protecting Germany's access to the North Sea and the Atlantic. In the Balkans, governments that had supported the Axis remained in power, while the rest of the region was reorganized under German supervision. Railways, highways, factories, and ports across Europe were rebuilt to serve a single economic system centered in Berlin. Within only a few years, Europe no longer consisted of independent powers. It had become a continent dominated by a single empire. But while Germany reshaped Europe, its greatest ally was transforming Asia. The Japanese Empire's new Asia. Japan emerged from the war as the undisputed power of East Asia. Manchuria was formally incorporated into the Japanese sphere. Korea remained under Japanese rule, while large parts of China's eastern coastline stayed under military occupation. Across Southeast Asia, Japanese authority continued over territories stretching from Burma to Malaya, from the Dutch East Indies to the Philippines. These regions supplied oil, rubber, iron, food, and other vital resources to the empire. The Imperial Japanese Navy dominated the Western Pacific. Major naval bases were established across the islands, securing Japan's control over the region's sea lanes. Tokyo declared the creation of a new order in Asia, presenting itself as the leading power of the continent. By the end of the decade, the Axis powers controlled most of continental Europe, large parts of Africa, and much of East and Southeast Asia. For the first time in modern history, two empires stood at the center of the Eastern Hemisphere: the new order of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. When the war ended, the global balance of power had completely changed. The United States chose to remain outside European affairs. The Atlantic Ocean became the boundary between two different worlds. Washington decided not to intervene on the European continent again, focusing instead on defending the Americas, expanding its industry, and strengthening its naval power across the Pacific. Britain emerged from the war economically exhausted. The empire had lost much of its former strength, and its influence over its colonies continued to decline. Although London rejected the new European order, it ultimately had no choice but to accept it. The Soviet Union suffered the greatest defeat of all. Moscow was no longer the powerful capital it had once been. Most of its European territory had been lost, and the government struggled to rebuild east of the Ural Mountains. The remaining Soviet forces established new defensive lines deep inside Asia as the country entered a long period of reconstruction. The world was no longer divided into two superpowers. Instead, a new balance emerged, dominated by German Europe and Imperial Japan in Asia. Daily life in the new world borders had changed. Passports had changed. Flags had changed. The new governments reorganized schools. Textbooks were rewritten. Newspapers and radio stations came under state control. German administrative systems were introduced across much of Europe. Railways and highways were no longer built only for transportation. They connected a continent-wide economic system directed from Berlin. Factories operated according to centrally planned production goals. A similar system developed across Asia. Japanese authorities integrated ports, railways, and industrial centers into a single economic network. Decisions made in Tokyo shaped life thousands of kilometers away. At first glance, the world appeared more organized than ever before. But that order was built upon strict state control. Science, technology, and the space race. The end of the war did not slow scientific progress. It accelerated it. German engineers continued developing jet aircraft, long-range rockets, and advanced submarines. Massive research centers were established, and military innovations gradually found their way into civilian life. Japan invested heavily in electronics, naval engineering, and shipbuilding. New industrial zones across the Pacific fueled the empire's technological expansion. Across the Atlantic, the United States continued its own research programs. All three major powers competed to build faster aircraft, more powerful rockets, and new sources of energy. By the 1950s, the greatest competition was no longer fought on battlefields. It was fought inside laboratories. The new war had become a race for technology, resistance movements, and new conflicts. The war was over, but true peace had never been achieved. Across much of Europe, underground resistance movements continued to operate. Former soldiers, civilians, and governments in exile carried out acts of sabotage, targeted railways, and launched small-scale attacks against the German administration. In parts of Eastern Europe, guerrilla warfare continued for years. The German army was forced to maintain large security forces to suppress these uprisings. A similar situation unfolded across Asia. Resistance groups continued fighting Japanese rule deep inside China. Throughout Southeast Asia, independence movements occasionally erupted into armed conflict. The Axis powers were no longer fighting battles on the front lines. Instead, they were fighting to maintain order across the vast territories they controlled. The world after Hitler. By the late 1950s, Germany faced a new question. Hitler could not live forever. In Berlin, discussions about the future of the state had already begun. Powerful figures within the party, senior military commanders, and the state bureaucracy were preparing for an eventual transition of power. At the same time, Japan continued strengthening its imperial system. The world's two greatest powers were no longer watching only their former enemies. They had begun watching each other. Economic competition intensified. Technological rivalry accelerated. Their spheres of influence continued to expand. They had won the war together. But shared interests would not remain the same forever. The world by the 1980s. Decades had passed. Europe was still part of a vast political and economic system centered in Berlin. In East Asia, the Japanese Empire remained the dominant regional power. Across the Atlantic, the United States preserved its economic and technological strength as the leading power of the Western Hemisphere. The world now rested upon a fragile balance between three great powers. The battles on the front lines had ended, but espionage, technological competition, economic rivalry, and regional crises never disappeared. This new world had been shaped by the victors of the Second World War. Humanity had followed a path completely different from the history we know. With countless possible outcomes, perhaps movements toward a more identity-neutral world would never have accelerated in the same way. Of course, everything presented in this documentary is an alternative history scenario. None of these events happened in real history, but if the outcome of a single war had been different, the world today might have looked something like this.